Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. I've got my colleague here, Serena Jones from Locality Property Buyers. So what we're going to talk about today is property purchase essentials and how every buyer can avoid costly mistakes and legal pitfalls. So we're going to go through buyer beware, also known as caveat emptor. What are the costly mistakes that often are made by buyers? We'll go through the practical steps for a successful purchase. We're going to be talking about the legal blind spots that can often derail a purchase. We'll talk about cooling off periods, and then we're going to go through what conditions you should be including in your contracts. And lastly, we'll finish up with what you should be checking in the lead up to a settlement. So just to introduce myself and a little bit about NB Property Law. So as I mentioned, my name's Kayleigh. I'm the director here at NB Property Law. We offer a personalised, proactive advice to our clients to help them minimise the risk and take the stress out of their next property transaction or estate planning matter. We're more than just a team of legal experts. We're dedicated problem solvers committed to creating personalised solutions to guide you forward. Whether it be residential or commercial property law concerns, we're here for our clients to provide the clarity and guidance that they need. Now, Serena, did you want me to introduce yourself, or did you want to do a little bit of introduction for yourself there?
I'm happy to introduce myself. Hello, everybody. I'm from Locality Property Buyers. So I work as a Brisbane-based buyer's agent, and I help people who are looking to purchase their next property in Brisbane's either inner city or middle ring suburbs. So I'm really helping people who often are busy, too busy, perhaps due to work commitments or family commitments, to look after the sourcing, the evaluating, inspecting, and ultimately negotiating on it and securing property. So whether you're something for your first home, or you're upsizing or downsizing, or potentially looking for investment property, I can really help you by taking on board the details all the way from sourcing the properties through to negotiation and settlement.
Wonderful, thanks, that's Serena. And now to start off, we'll talk about like the buyer beware, which is also known as the caveat emptor. So this term caveat emptor, you've probably maybe heard it before, but what does it actually mean? So it translates to let the buyer beware. And it means that the buyer is responsible to perform their own due diligence when it comes to property purchases. So has the new seller disclosure statements changed this position? In short, the answer is no, but it has shifted it slightly. So the seller is not required to let the buyer know about any structural issues, any potential flooding matters, the presence of asbestos. So, for example, the buyer will need to still check these things themselves. Now I'm going to hand back over to Serena to talk about the costly mistakes she often sees that buyers do make when purchasing properties.
Thank you, Kayleigh. So we're just put together a few slides here on some of the things that I often see inexperienced buyers, the mistakes that they can sometimes make. And sometimes this is down to inexperience. Sometimes it's down to maybe feeling rushed in the process, or feeling the pressure on when it comes to trying to secure a property that they found that they really like. So just a few pitfalls that you could fall into, but just some reminders and checklists here to help you avoid those. So the first one I find often happens is sometimes buyers take the information that's provided in sales listings at face value. So I would always say, don't take the information that's provided too literally. Sometimes information can be poorly worded. Sometimes it can be not fact checked completely. And in some instances, there can be mistakes and it can be inaccurate. So, for example, things that come up that I see, properties being advertised as having more bedrooms than legally they actually have. So, certain rooms that are not legal height, and there are insurance implications if you do use those rooms as habitable rooms. And if there was, say, a claim made after, say, a fire or something happened in a room that had been used as a habitable room and shouldn't have been, you may find that claim doesn't pay out. So it's important to fact check information. Again, when it comes to floor plans and dimensions, I would say treat these as a guide rather than being gospel. It's really helpful to take a tape measure with you to inspections and just measure the rooms out for yourself. Particularly important if you have big pieces of furniture that it's important that a property can accommodate. And if a listing or marketing information says that a certain development can be made, such as that you can add a pool or add a granny flat. Sometimes it will be worded along the lines of, ideal opportunity to add a granny flat to the rear, or ideal opportunity to add a pool for the next owner. Don't assume that that will definitely be allowed. There are legal restrictions, sometimes in terms of planning restrictions, zoning restrictions. When it comes to a pool, you'll need to check whether there are underground services such as water, sewage pipes, and so on that might impede the installation of such a structure. So mistake number 2 here, just a list of things that, again, it's important to check. It's really important not to skip on these due diligence checks in the excitement of finding a property that you like. You don't want to find that there are hidden surprises down the line that have unexpected costs for you. And most of these things are very, very easy to check. Almost all of them, the information can be obtained free of charge. So, for example, the flood and the bushfire overlays there, also the zoning, whether there's any heritage or character overlays. Sorry, somebody just said, can we update the slides? I've been clicking along the slides using the slide sorter at the bottom. I don't know whether somebody at NB Law would pick up and run through this.
Should be a mistake 2. Everyone should be able to see that.
I'm on slide 8. So there is a slide order at the bottom, 8 and 31. We're currently on. I think
we're all sorted.
All right. So yes, transport noise overlays, zoning, heritage, character overlays, all of these can be checked on council websites. So, for example, Brisbane City Plan will enable you to do these searches and check for yourself. There are also paid for council searches, so inspection of record search and building searches that can be done. Those are paid. You can order those yourselves directly through council, or your conveyancer can help you with those. There is another website that's really useful called Before You Dig Australia, which will enable you to put in a property address and search for whether there are underground pipes, such as water network pipes, sewage pipes, stormwater pipes, etc. If you wanted to know whether there might be the possibility of adding a pool. So all of these things are really important to do, so you don't have surprises for further down the line. If you're purchasing a property that sits in a body corporate community titled management scheme, then it's really important to check for financial information, make sure that you understand the annual fees that will be involved in taking that property on, and whether there are any additional levies coming down the line for any major works. You don't want to, again, have an unexpected surprise for a large cost that you weren't expecting after settlement. If you're unsure on any of these, your conveyancer or indeed a buyer's agent can guide you on accessing this information. And also mistake number 3, so the next slide, waiving legal protection. So in Queensland, it is standard to be able to include a building and pest condition and a finance condition into a contract. So if you're entering into a conditional contract, then these give you the opportunity to, over a period of time, 14 days, or it could be less if you don't feel you need quite so long, to properly have that the property checked by a building inspector to ensure that it's structurally sound, that there's no major defects, that there's no termite issues, and so on. And also to check with your lender or through your mortgage broker that your lender will provide you with the funds that you're expecting to be made available to you. So this enables you to make those checks, and if either one of those comes up with a negative outcome, then you can withdraw from that purchase without penalty, as long as it's based on one of those conditions and you've had those conditions included in the contract. If you are purchasing at option, it's important to get these things checked up front. So speak to your mortgage broker or your lender to make sure that you're good for the finance, and you can request to go in and do a building and pest inspection prior to option day and make sure that you've got those reassurances that the property that you will be purchasing is in a sound condition. And always get your conveyancer to do a contract review before you sign anything. You can send the draft contract through to your conveyancer, and it's highly recommended, especially if there are any special conditions in there that the seller is including. You want to have an understanding of what those are, and also if there are any conditions that you yourself would like to have included, your conveyancer will help you with the wording of those. So it's important to understand that, if you're waiving any of these conditions, or if you're accepting any special conditions without fully understanding those can have consequences for you further down the line, either financial consequences or potentially legal consequences. So always seek professional advice before you sign anything. So we're just going to move into now, from slide 10, practical steps to a successful purchase. So these are just some tips. You might want to sort of take some notes and use these as a bit of a checklist for purchasing property going forward. I would say step number one is always to ensure that you understand your financial position well in advance. So if you're dealing directly with a bank or a lender, make sure that you have gone through everything that they've required from you in terms of your financial situation, any paperwork that they've required, and that you've completed an application before you start looking for a property. You don't want to wait until you've found a property that you really love to kick off this process, because it can take it can take a little bit longer than people sometimes expect to get all of that paperwork completed and get a response back from the lender. Particularly if you go through a mortgage broker, they will assess your situation against multiple lenders. So it's worth allowing a good amount of time for that, to make sure that the right lender can be selected for your individual circumstances. You also want to make sure that you have budgeted for all of the costs that will be involved in a property transaction. So as well as the actual cost of the property, you're going to need to factor in things like stamp duty, your legal fees, your conveyancing fees, building and pest inspection or inspections. You may find that you conduct a building and pest inspection on more than one property if the first property that you do that on you decide not to purchase. So make sure you've got a little bit of a buffer. Also for things further down the line, such as insurance on the property once you have entered into a contract, and ultimately your removalist costs to get yourself moved into that property, unless it's an investment property. So again, take advice on this. If you're unclear on any of the costs involved, you'll be able to talk to your broker, your lender, for some indicative costs. You'll be able to reach out to a conveyancer to get quotes on their side of things. And also set your comfort limit, because just because a bank or a mortgage broker says you are able to borrow a certain amount of money and you can afford to purchase a property up to a certain limit, it doesn't mean that you have to. So it's important that you not only understand how much you can borrow, but that you understand your additional monthly outgoings for the lifestyle that you live, and ensure that any monthly repayments are manageable with your other commitments each month. So once you understand your finances and you're in a position to start looking for a property, it's also really important to get to know the market or markets that you're considering purchasing within. So this may just be one suburb, or it may be a number of suburbs. And to get to know that market, one of the things it's really useful to do is to start tracking recent sales. So here I would say it's useful to keep a spreadsheet, track properties in suburb order. You can keep information such as the property address, a link, a hyperlink through to that property to remind you about that property, key features about that property, number of bedrooms, number of bathrooms, any unique features that made that property particularly special, and then ultimately what that property sold for. Sometimes sold pricing isn't registered on realestate.com or Domain. So if pricing is not displayed once a property has sold, you can call up that real estate agent and ask them if they can disclose what that property sold for. It's really important that you're basing your sort of market intelligence on actual sold property, and not guide prices and offers over, or expected prices that you saw a property advertised for, because what that property actually sold for may have been above or below that. So it's only knowing the actual price that a property sold for, that's going to help you really understand the current market climate and what purchasers are actually willing to pay for those types of properties right now at the current point in time. So, getting to know your market will help you have a really clear idea of, what properties are selling for, also how quickly properties are selling, whether they're selling within just a matter of days of coming onto the market, whether properties are routinely selling at auction, what the clearance rates are like, or whether a lot of properties are passing in and then selling after auction. So all of these things are clues. They're clues to you to help you to understand how quickly things might move once you've seen a property advertised that you like, or you've expected a property and you feel it could be a contender. So being prepared will really help you position yourself to be able to move quickly and be a few steps ahead of potentially the other buyers that you might find that you're competing against. So step 3, this is about really sitting down and working out what's important to you with your property purchase. We all have our wish lists and the things that we dream about for our next home or our investment property. But it's worth sitting down and really spending some time working out which of those wish list items are must-haves, which are the mandatories, and which are the features that you would be more flexible on, and they're perhaps nice to have, but not necessarily deal breakers and reasons that you would decide not to purchase a property on. If there are any deal breakers, make a note of what those are. Don't lose sight of those. Again, we'll come on to some of the mistakes that people can make in the heat of the moment when they're feeling quite emotional about a property. So having a checklist written down that you can take to each property can really help you remember, what were the deal breakers that we've decided, what are our non-negotiables that we definitely, don't want to compromise on, and what are the things that we might be willing to compromise on if there are enough of the other boxes ticked. It's also worth thinking really long term, because a property that might suit you for now may not still suit you in 5 years' time. So think about your plans for the near future. Are you looking to grow a family? Are you looking to, will you be working from home? Things like that. And, make sure that any property choices and requirements have factored those in mind. And if there are more than one of you purchasing, it's really useful upfront to ensure that you're all aligned on the criteria that you've agreed upon, rather than that you're walking through properties, inspecting properties, and you're starting to get excited that you found the one, and then only to find that the person that you're purchasing with doesn't feel that it's the one because there's some particular aspect or feature that they don't like. So try to agree all of these up front, and if there are certain things that you're not aligned on, try to work through that and unpack that in advance, so that you understand where the grey areas are and what the compromises might be in that situation. Okay, and step 4, this is about assembling your team. So, there are key people that you're absolutely going to need. So we mentioned previously, you're going to need a mortgage broker or a lender, unless you're a cash buyer. You're also likely to need a solicitor or conveyancer. So unless you're legally trained yourself, I would engage, with a solicitor early, so that you know who that person is that you're going to reach out to. Again, you sometimes can be surprised how quickly you find a property that you really like, and you don't want to be caught out that you haven't lined anybody up and you've got a contract that you want somebody to review. A selling agent is telling you that the offers are going to close off, within 48 hours or something like that, and you haven't even started to have conversations with conveyancers or find out what they charge. So speaking to a few people in advance, finding out what they charge, you can get recommendations from friends, family, people who've purchased previously. You could ask your broker or lender if they can recommend anybody if you haven't used anybody before. Similarly, with building and pest inspector, you're likely to need a building and pest inspector. As I mentioned previously, highly recommended that you don't proceed without having a property checked. So in the preliminary stages leading up to finding a property that you want to purchase, it's worth reaching out to a few building and pest inspectors. Again, find out how much they charge, find out how quickly they're likely to be able to get into a property. So do they normally work to a 2 or 3 day turnaround? Do they need longer than that? Are they sometimes able to get into a property the next day if you need something to be turned around quickly? So understand what the parameters are that they work within, and have some phone numbers on hand so that you can be ready to call through that list when the time comes. And also consider whether you need a buyer's agent. So I mentioned some of the reasons previously in the introduction as to why people might sometimes choose to use a buyer's agent. It might be down to time constraints, working long hours, or down to their family commitments. It might be because they're first home buyers and they don't feel confident in terms of understanding what due diligence checks they need to do or how to go about those. Or sometimes it can be based on purely on location, that somebody's perhaps not located in the same area where they're trying to buy, and they need boots on the ground and somebody who can actually go through properties and be their eyes and ears to help them understand whether a property suits their requirements. So you can reach out to a buyer's agent. Most buyer's agents will do a consultation with you. No obligation. It's a chance to just talk through your requirements, find out what they offer, how they work, what kinds of services they can provide, and at what cost. And then you can come back to them and further down the line and decide whether that's something that would be of use to you or not. But really, this is about putting yourself in a position to be able to move quickly when the time comes, and that you're not sort of left scrambling if you do find a property that you really like and you don't have you don't have any team assembled to assist you, and this can sometimes be what leads to people missing out on properties simply because they're a little bit underprepared on some of these things. Step number 5, my recommendation would be question everything. When it comes to purchasing a property, we're not talking about insignificant sums of money here, so it's perfectly legitimate for you to be asking the sales agent for a lot more information than what may have been provided in the sales listing. So when you're going through a property, ask them, what information do they have, what certifications do they have on hand in terms of paperwork. Do they have final building certifications, Form 21, for example, for any additional structures that have been added to the property, such as carports, extra garaging, studios, and so on and so forth, extensions? Do they have waterproofing certificates? So if there's been renovations taking place and bathrooms have been replaced, for example, they should be able to provide waterproofing certificates for those. Pool safety certificates if there's a pool in the yard. Ask them what paperwork they have. Just because they haven't been forthcoming with those or putting them out on the kitchen bench at the inspection doesn't mean that they're not available. So ask lots of questions. Take a tape measure. Measure the rooms yourself, measure the dimensions of the rooms, measure the heights of the rooms. You're looking for a minimum of 2.4 meters for habitable rooms, and visit the property at different times of the day. This can be really important because often people are just visiting a property maybe on a Saturday morning, and you don't know what the property is like during the week, and it could be that that's actually quite a thoroughfare or quite a cut through for traffic during commuter times. You might want to visit during the morning. You might want to visit in the evening at peak times. You might want to actually drive back there and sit in the car and see what's the street like during school pickup time. These can all give you clues as to what it's going to be like to live in that property, if it's a place that you're going to reside in. And if you've got specific questions about the property, don't feel afraid to knock on neighbours' doors. I do this routinely as a buyer's agent, so I ask a lot of questions about the neighbourhood. I ask questions, particularly if I hear flight noise, or I've done the due diligence that shows me that we are quite close to flight paths. Just asking people, how frequent are they finding that, and at what times of the day, and does it encroach into the evening? And you can find a lot out from knocking on doors, and neighbours are often very, very accommodating to share information about their street and their neighbourhood with you. And I would also say, always double check any comparable sales information that's provided by the selling agent. So again, you will often have information laid out at inspections or emailed to you after an inspection with examples of properties in the vicinity and what those other properties have sold for. But they're not necessarily comparable to the property that you're looking at. So again, don't take everything at face value and think just because a property on that list is worth $2 million, that it means that the property that you've just walked through is worth $2 million. You really do need to do your own due diligence and compare the floor plans, the photos, the finishes, the condition of the property that you're looking through, compared to the other properties that you've been that you've been looking at in terms of your market research, and determine on balance, whether you've just walked through a property that's inferior or superior to those comparable properties. You can tell a lot through looking at photos. If you haven't been through, try and get through as many properties as you can, even properties that you're not necessarily going to purchase. That will really help you with your market research. But even properties that you've not been through, you can find out a lot of information through the online photos and the floor plan. So again, question everything. Don't take everything at face value, and fact find as much as you can. And then coming on to the emotion, it's really easy to let emotion take over when you find somewhere that you love. The excitement of feeling that you found the one can make us all behave in strange ways. Similarly, the emotion and fear of missing out on a property can make people feel that it's sometimes worth sidestepping anything that might potentially slow down the process and lead to them possibly missing out. But you don't want to put yourself at risk. Some of these things that we've talked about that can put you at risk from financial implications or indeed legal implications, which Kayleigh will pick up and go through a little bit more in a moment. A lot of things are very quick to check, and it doesn't mean that you're going to miss out on a property just because you take a little bit of time just to ensure that you understand what you're taking on with that property. If you do find a flaw, so for example, if you are in a conditional contract and you've got a building and pest inspection that takes place, and something comes up during that inspection, then you're perfectly within your rights to request for a tradesperson to go in off of the back of the inspection to look into that issue in more detail. That still will fall under the exploratory phase of the building and pest condition. So if, say, for example, high moisture readings have come up in or around the bathrooms, and you want to have that looked into to determine whether it's really just resealing and regrouting potentially, or whether there's a much bigger issue with bathrooms needing potentially replacing, then take the time to have that looked into, rather than just brushing it under the carpet, because that could be the difference of maybe 1,000 or 2,000 further down the line versus 20,000+, which is considerably more. Again, don't overstretch yourself financially. This can often happen at auction, when in the heat of the moment on the auction floor, people recognize that they're getting to their limit. You may have discussed and set yourself a limit before going into that auction, but then in the heat of the moment, and you feel that you're getting really close and you don't want to lose out, you find that you've actually overtaken and gone quite far beyond the limit that you've set yourself. You don't want to find yourself in financial stress going forwards and have regret for purchasing that property, or indeed, worst case scenario, find that you can't fulfill the purchase of that property and end up losing deposits and so on. And then the final point there, coming back to waiving of conditions, just always ensure that before taking any action, you have discussed what those conditions mean and what the waiving of those conditions would mean, and if there are any risks to you, and how large those risks are, and whether you're willing to take those risks. You really do need to discuss all of that with a legal specialist to make sure that somebody has properly explained to you what that means, and that you can make those decisions in an informed way, rather than just off the cuff and then having regret afterwards. And the final step for my section, I would always say, if in doubt about anything at all, then seek professional help. You really don't want to end up looking back over your shoulder after making a purchase and regretting the purchase that you've made, either because you feel that you've massively overpaid, or because you realise that there are some hidden unexpected issues with the property because you didn't do certain due diligence checks, or there's unapproved structures on that property because you didn't do council checks, and there's an enforcement notice coming through from council and you actually have to take something down. So some of these issues can be quite major, and just for the sake of a 10-minute conversation with a professional, most people will give you some straightforward advice, out of the generosity of their heart, if you've got a question that you want to ask people. But certainly if you've got your team around you that you've appointed, going to the right person with the right question at the right time can ensure that your rights are protected and that you don't expose yourself to risk. So when it comes to financial advice, recommend talking to your lender or your mortgage broker. Obviously for tax advice, that would be an accountant. Legal advice would be a solicitor or conveyancer. If it's something to do with the building, the structure, potentially that would be a building inspector or pest inspector if you've had an inspection done, or indeed a builder or a specialist tradesperson, depending on what the issue is. And then information regarding the property itself and due diligence surrounding that property, and information regarding the specific market conditions at that point in time in that area. A buyer's agent can help you with that. So I think Kayleigh just confirmed there was a question about, are these slides going to be coming out? Yes, they are. So hopefully this will be useful for you to look back on. I'm going to hand over to Kayleigh now, who's going to cover a little bit more about the legal side of things and the legal pitfalls that can derail a purchase.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that, Serena. So many great tips there for buyers looking to purchase property. So really appreciate that. So as you mentioned, I'm going to take you through now some of the legal blind spots that can often derail a purchase for a buyer. So the first one is talking about tenants and when the actual lease expires. So if you are expecting vacant possession at settlement, in order to be eligible for the home or first home transfer duty concession, the tenants must vacate the property within 6 months if they are on a fixed term lease. So for periodic leases, if they are on a periodic lease, you will need to issue a notice to leave once the property actually settles. You can't extend their lease either. So it's important to remember that you can't extend the lease with the tenant before taking possession if you are seeking to claim that first home or home concession. Another pitfall that often crops up is deposits. So deposits are obviously generally a large sum of money. You need to make sure that you're actually able to transfer that deposit amount as agreed, and that your bank does have, the proper authority for that transfer limit. So that may involve actually contacting your bank to increase your daily limit so that property deposit can actually be paid when it's due and payable. Okay, so the other issue that we often see is the correct entity not being used, so the correct buying entity. You can't just change the buying entity once the contract has been signed. We often see, people buying properties under a self-managed super fund. So, is the bare trustee and the trust actually listed as the buyer? If you are purchasing in your personal name, does it include the full legal name of all parties that are wishing to buy the property? Now, if the incorrect entity was used when the contract was signed, we would have to do what's called a deed of rescission to essentially rescind the existing contract and then enter into a whole new contract with the correct buying entity. So that comes at legal costs as well. So we do want to avoid that at all costs if we can. So obviously important to try and get that legal buying entity correct from the outset. Other things to consider if you're needing to sell is the property needing to be subject to the sale of your existing property. So if you're buying a contract, does it need to settle simultaneously with the existing property you're settling? And the other point is does the seller need to request a sunset clause as well? If you are selling an existing property, there may be a certain time frame that the person you're purchasing your properties for is going to cut that out. So essentially they can terminate the contract if you weren't to sell your existing property before that date. Now, cooling off period. So cooling off period is a term that is included in residential property contracts unless they're purchased at auction. So it allows the buyer, not the seller, to actually terminate the contract within 5 business days from the contract date, should they change their mind. Now, they can do so, but it does come at a 0.25% penalty of the purchase price, which is deducted from the deposit prior to it being refunded. In some cases, the seller may choose not to withhold that that penalty, but they do have that right to withhold if they choose to. So buyers need to be aware of that. Now, the termination must be in writing and state that the buyer is terminating under the cooling off period. So unless the property is sold at auction, unless it's within 2 days after the auction by a registered bidder, if it's to a buyer buying 3 lots at the same time, or the contract's due to an exercise of an option, or it's being sold to a publicly listed corporation or the buyer in the state or statutory body, then it will be subject to cooling off period unless that's been waived. Buyers may think that it's enough just to let the agent know that they no longer wish to purchase the property, but it is important that they give notice to the correct people and include the correct wording. So those people are generally the solicitors involved. So, the buyer should let their solicitor know, and that solicitor will contact the seller solicitor to formally terminate the contract under that cooling off period. Now, conditions that you want to include in your contract. So Serena did talk about these briefly before from a buyer's agent's point of view, and I'll touch on them again now. So the first one is the building and pest condition. So what can you actually get inspected? So all the improvements on the land, so this includes the building structures, retaining walls, any septic systems, any hot water systems, and included shadows, can be inspected under this building and pest inspection. So what are your rights if you are not satisfied with the inspection? So if you are not satisfied with the building and pest report, the contract allows you to terminate and get your deposit back, but you must act reasonably when considering the results. So what is actually considered as reasonable then? So there isn't actually a set criteria, and it is determined on a case-by-case basis. So it doesn't have to be just one major defect. It can be several defects that may incur a significant cost to the buyer to actually repair these things should they proceed with the purchase. So can you terminate then if a structure isn't approved? So this again depends, on the situation. So unapproved structures does not mean that the property cannot be used or it has a defect. So not necessarily the case. Another condition that's important to include in a contract is finance. So you need to make sure you have allowed enough time to have finance approved. So you'll be able to speak with your bank or your mortgage broker if you're going through a mortgage broker as to the time period that's needed for finance. So often we see, 14 days. Sometimes it might be a shorter period of 7 days or 21 days, depending on the situation. If all sections of the finance condition are not completed, then the condition will not apply. So a buyer must take all reasonable steps to actually obtain their finance approval, and this means actually obviously applying for finance. So even if the buyer is to obtain finance approval, if they are not satisfied with the terms offered by the lender, then they can terminate the contract under the finance clause. Okay, another important condition to include in the contracts is the body corporate records inspection search. So this gives a buyer the ability to terminate the contract if they are not satisfied that they will not be materially prejudiced by any circumstances discovered on the body corporate inspection of record search. So what does materially prejudice mean then? So it means that the buyer would be adversely impacted if they were required to complete the purchase. So with the body corporate records inspection search, it can be, sometimes a lengthy document, but the things you really want to be checking are the meeting minutes. So you want to be having a look at the decisions regarding the building issues, any outstanding debts, what the overall environment of the complex is, and how the body corporate actually deals with complaints. It's important to also look at the sinking fund forecasts. So this is going to show what the anticipated increases to the sinking fund levies are over the coming years. The other important reports that are included in the body corporate inspection of record search is the cladding, asbestos report, there'll be an energy report, and any other related agreements you should be having a look through. So the other thing which Serena spoke about is a due diligence condition. So the due diligence condition may cover more specifically for unapproved structures. So as mentioned earlier, unapproved structures does not automatically give you the right to terminate under the building and pest inspection condition, but it would do so under this due diligence condition. In fact, a lack of final inspection certificates doesn't even mean that the building doesn't have approval. It could just mean that the building was approved prior to April 1998, before final inspections were mandated. So prior to April 1998, councils are responsible for issuing building approvals, and generally they don't have records of a final inspection as they were not required to provide them. So post April 1998 was when the private certifiers become responsible for the final inspections, which is what's known as a Form 21. However, if you are buying a property with an unimproved structure, you could be faced with a costly rectification bill or be required to remove the structure. Now, due diligence, you may also be looking at the overlays, which Serena touched on before, and wanting to know, how these affect your property. So overlays are part of the planning scheme, and they're designed to ensure that certain values and constraints apply when considering development of that land. Another thing to consider with due diligence is there a pool certificate, and is that valid, and when does it actually expire? As part of due diligence, you may also look to conduct a survey, and what are your rights if the survey does uncover any defects. So in Queensland, a property survey can uncover defects like boundary errors or encroachments, which give you rights to negotiate with the seller or seek compensation, or if there is a defect which is significant, to actually terminate the contract, but this must be done so prior to settlement. The other thing that you may be looking at with due diligence is what the actual zoning of the property is. So what this means is we've got generally 7 categories for zoning of properties. So that's residential zones, we've got centre zones, industry zones, recreation zones, tourism zones, environmental zones, and any other zones. So zones and other planning controls outline what development can occur and how the land can actually be used. So for example, if you're buying land that is currently zoned as low to medium density residential, but you're buying the land to build a 5-story unit complex, then you're unlikely to get the development approval for that. So zones are regulated by local government, so council, through their local planning schemes, and your solicitor can actually, they can't search the surrounding areas of the actual property you're purchasing. So you may want to do your own investigations into that surrounding area. Now, the other thing that's important to do is a pre-settlement inspection check. So the contract allows for a pre-settlement inspection to be done. We always recommend doing this as close to settlement as possible, so generally on the morning of settlement. Now, the things you want to be checking with the pre-settlement inspections is that the smoke alarms do still comply. Has the seller actually removed their furniture and chattels from the property? Was there any damage when the seller moved out? And has the seller left what was agreed? So basically, the property needs to be in the same condition it was when you signed the contract. If there are any issues with the pre-settlement inspection, then you want to be notifying your solicitor prior to settlement so that they can they've got a few different things. They may, request an extension. They may request money be reduced in the purchase price to allow any issues to be rectified by the buyer post-settlement. They could request that a certain amount be retained in the solicitor's trust account to deal with a certain issue if it wasn't rectified by the seller in a certain time frame. So there's a few different options there. Now, if you do have any further questions that want to go through, by all means, feel free to scan this QR code here. Happy to have a obligation-free 30-minute consultation to help you understand what your options are and what your next steps are as well. But essentially, that kind of wraps us up and hopefully gives you a few pointers and a few tips about, things to be aware of, the pitfalls, and things to take into account to avoid any costly mistakes when looking to make your next property purchase. I've got Serena's contact details there as well as my own. So if you do have any further questions that you want to ask more privately, then you're welcome to do so. But we will open it up now for any questions that anyone has. If you want to take yourself off mute or pop them in the chat bar. There's a couple that are already in there. So the first one says, kindly talk at some point about the issues involved in buying an apartment in a multi-storey complex apartment. So I think for me, for that one, it is making sure that you would undertake a body corporate records inspection search and the contract subject to that, so that you understand how the body corporate is operating, and what is forecast for the body corporate, and if there are any issues, you would be able to terminate the contract and receive your deposit back under that one. But I'll hand over to you, Serena, if you've got any tips and points about that one as well.
No, I was just going to say exactly the same thing. It just comes down to making sure that you have a full understanding of the financial side of things. Body corporate fees can vary widely. So normally you're paying into an admin fund, a sinking fund, and also paying an insurance levy. So there are often 3 payments that you're paying into quarterly or every 4 months, and those combined will come to an annual sum. So it's really important that you understand and are able to afford that on an ongoing basis. And as Kayleigh was saying, by checking body corporate records, you will also find out a lot more about the complex, how they handle disputes, how they handle complaints, whether there are any outstanding disputes or complaints, whether there are any financial issues that are unresolved, or that there's been a vote on a particular improvement or repair of significant cost that has been voted in. There could be a large levy that you're going to be already committed to coming down the line at you. So there's a lot that you can find out through exploring those minutes and seeing what people have been discussing previously, and the vibe, I suppose, as well, of that the scheme that you will be a part of, because you will become a part of that community, and you would be expected to participate in annual general meetings and vote on things going forward. So it's just really good to just explore back on some of that and get a sense of how things work.
Wonderful. Thanks, that's Serena. We've got another question that's popped up there as well, saying, how do we check that there are no encumbrances? So in Queensland, we can do what's called a title search. So that will list for us any registered interests and encumbrances. So, there may be mortgages, easements, any covenants or caveats should be all registered on that title. And then if there are any particular encumbrances there that you want searched further, we can do what's called a dealing image search to find out more about that encumbrance. So if it is, an easement, what it's used for, what the purpose of it is, etc. With easements in particular, they're generally over a certain part of the land. So we then can obviously do a survey plan search as well, which will show the area that easement covers as well. I'm not sure if you've got anything to add as well on that point, Serena.
No, I think you've covered everything, I think, on that.
Cool. And then we've got one last question here that says, what if you find out the dishwasher and gas hot water do not work when you finally move in? So generally this is after settlement. As I mentioned, the pre-settlement inspection, those things should be checked then. Once it's settled, it's a lot harder to try and claw back on things like that. So, we really want to be checking those things, when we're doing probably the actual building and pest inspection is probably the most important place to do, because if we're doing it even at the pre-settlement inspection, we still need to prove that those things were actually working at the time we signed the contract as well. If we can prove that, then like I said, we've got those options. As I mentioned earlier, we can delay settlement until the seller can rectify them. We can request money off the purchase price so that the buyer can fix those things post-settlement, or potentially request that one of the solicitors retain a certain amount in their trust account to allow the buyer a certain period of time to fix those things. I don't know if you had anything further to input there.
All I was just going to say is, yes, a certain amount can be checked during the building and pest inspection. A good building and pest inspector will check that things turn on and so on. One of the things that I do when I go to inspections is I'm photographing and videoing and taking evidence of, so I go around and switch all the lights on, and I switch all the fans on in all of the rooms and turn all the air cons on, and then I walk through and I'm just sort of narrating, so the air con's working in the front bedroom, as is the fan, and all the lights are working, and then go through and say, now I'm in the back bedroom, the aircon's working as is the fan. And if you've got a record, as Kayleigh was saying, that things were working at a certain point in time, and then certain things don't turn on or function or do what they should do just prior to settlement, well then it's easier to have that conversation that there's something to put right. And I would say, don't skip the pre-settlement inspection. This is one of the most important things that I do as part of my end-to-end service for clients. You know, my job is not over once we're in an unconditional contract. I always say to my clients, you know, I'm there right the way through to the handover of keys, and one of the most important steps is going in on the morning of settlement or the day before if the property is empty, and checking that it's absolutely, you know, once it's been vacated, it's clean, there's no rubbish or waste been left, that there's been no damage. Sometimes when people are moving out, holes can be accidentally punched in walls and things like that. You'd be surprised, you know, what can happen. So that's the point at which, again, photo evidence, get in touch directly with the conveyancer and say, just hold on. You know, we're not necessarily going to settle at 2 o'clock today or whatever time it's booked in for. We need to have a conversation between the solicitors as to, you know, what's going to be done about this, i.e., is there going to be some kind of make good and a reduction of the purchase price, or is settlement going to be delayed to give the seller the opportunity to put that right and back to the condition that it was when you went under contract? Small step, but important step. And often people think, oh, it'll be fine, I'm busy at work. But, you know, send a representative, try and find a way to make that happen.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that, Serena. I don't think we've got any other questions there, but if you do have any other questions or anything you want to discuss with Serena or myself more, you're welcome to contact us via the details included here on the screen. Otherwise, thank you so much for Serena for joining us, and thank you to all our guests for coming along. And hopefully you've been able to gain some insightful information regarding property purchase essentials and how every buyer can avoid some costly mistakes and legal pitfalls. So thank you everyone for your time. Thank you, Serena.
Thank you, Kayleigh. Thanks, everybody.